Few stories are more universal than that of the sibling rivalry. After all, it's a tale so old, it's one of the first ones told in the Bible itself. So when a wrestling booker is looking to get people invested with a good angle, then this can be an easy one to fall back on. That said, for as much as it worked well for the likes of the Harts, the Hardys, or even the Steiners, perhaps no one has ever done the Warring Brothers story better than Kane and The Undertaker. And that's because, given the over-the-top nature of each character, it's allowed for WWE to go full telenovela each time it iterates, creating an epic for the ages in the process. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in The Undertaker vs. Kane, Wrestling's Greatest Rivalries, Episode 2. Of course, if we're going by kayfabe, the whole storyline starts way back in the mid-1960s, as it was there where a young Mark Calaway and his brother Kane would both be born a few years apart into a family of funeral home owners. At some point during their childhood, however, a fire would tragically break out at their parents' place of work and not only kill both mother and father, but presumably leave young Kane for dead too. So trying to put the trauma of this behind him then, Mark Calaway would take up a job working as an undertaker for family friend Paul Bearer. And it was while doing this that his larger-than-life physique and seeming invulnerability to pain would see Bearer get him involved in the world of wrestling. So cut to 1990, and Mark, now going by the name The Undertaker, would make his WWF debut at that November's Survivor Series, with him being so impressive here that over the next 7 years, he'd prove to be a dominating force in the company and a perennial main eventer. But while Bearer had been managing him throughout most of this period, things would change in the summer of 1996, as there he would turn his back on the dead man and instead align himself with heated rival Mankind. And this would lead to the two feuding for much of the next year then, with this continuing all the way up until the point The Undertaker won the WWF title from Psycho Sid at WrestleMania 13 in March of 1997. So now realizing there was a lot of money to be made off his former client again, Bearer decided he wanted to manage the new champ once more, a request which was, understandably, rejected at first. That said, the heel manager still did have an ace up his sleeve, which he thought would help him achieve his goals, as over the next few weeks, he'd attempt to blackmail the dead man. And the way he would do so would be to claim that, if his former client didn't let him have his old role back, he'd reveal his darkest secret to the world. But while at first the champion would continue to reject these pleas, eventually he'd have no choice but to welcome his old friend back into the fold as, whatever his secret was, he certainly didn't want anybody to know about it. Even still, though, everyone has their limits, and so, by the summer of 1997, after having put up with months of abuse from Bearer, The Undertaker would finally decide he'd had enough and would kick him to the curb. By doing this, however, he was basically ensuring that his now former manager would reveal everything he knew. And a couple of weeks later then, this was exactly what happened, as live on an episode of Raw, Paul Bearer would spill the beans. But what did he know? Well, as it turned out, his big reveal was that the Phenom fans had come to love was nothing more than a murderer. And as if that wasn't enough for them to digest, there was also the fact that Kane was still alive too. Sure, at this point fans had no idea who Kane was, but even the hint of some mysterious figure out there in the shadows, combined with the dark revelations about their world champion, was enough to send shockwaves through WWF. And this would only get worse as the weeks went on and it became clear that the murders The Undertaker had allegedly committed were against his own parents. Yes, in the words of Paul Bearer, the Phenom had been the one who started that fatal fire so many years back. What he didn't realize, though, was that his brother Kane had survived this fire and spent the subsequent decades waiting for a chance to get his revenge. So with this knowledge sitting in the back of his head then, the dead man would be distracted enough to lose the WWF title to Bret Hart at August 3rd SummerSlam. Of course, this loss was partially caused by Shawn Michaels too, so as a result of this, the pair would spin off into their own feud after that, a feud which climaxed in the first ever Hell in a Cell match at October 5th's Bad Blood in Your House. And with all the Phenom's focus being on surviving this brutal encounter with HBK then, Paul Bearer felt like it was the perfect moment to finally unleash his secret weapon, as at the end of the Cell match, just when the babyface was about to pick up the win, the lights would cut out and a now familiar organ sound would start up, signaling the arrival of the Big Red Machine. After that, Vince McMahon would scream his now iconic call, "That's gotta be Kane!" as, with bearer in tow, the younger sibling walked his way down to the ring and proceeded to lay out his brother with a tombstone piledriver, costing him the victory in the process. So you'd think then that the obvious thing for the dead man to do following this would be to seek revenge by going after Kane. But that's where you'd be wrong, because not wanting to fight his own flesh and blood, The Undertaker continually refused to meet him in the ring over the months which followed, causing the Big Red Machine to instead go on a rampage and destroy every WWF superstar he could get his hands on. And as he was mowing through the likes of Mankind and Vader, his brother would be trying to put the whole thing behind him, as, still denying he had anything to do with the fire, he'd instead try to talk some sense into Kane by explaining that Bearer was just manipulating him. But while for a while it seemed like there was no chance he'd be able to get through to his brother, at one point in early 1998, for a brief moment, the two actually looked to be on the same page. How did this happen? Well, in the lead-up to his WWF title match with Shawn Michaels at that January's Royal Rumble, DX would jump the #1 contender and start giving him a beatdown, only for the Big Red Machine to then come down to the ring himself and save his older sibling. Of course, any hopes that this was going to be the start of a new union between the two would be thwarted when, at the Royal Rumble, Kane revealed he'd been luring The Undertaker into a false sense of security all along so that he could attack him again and lock him in a casket, which he then set on fire. But while this would have killed any normal man, it couldn't put an end to the Phenom, as when the casket was checked afterwards, the body of the fan favorite had mysteriously disappeared, with no one seeing any sight of him again in the weeks following. That was until a couple of months later, at which point he would finally make his return to Raw to announce that enough was enough, and that at WrestleMania 14 he would take on his brother one-on-one. So it was all set for March 29th then, the battle for the ages between the unstoppable force and the immovable object. But how would this all play out? Well, after a punishing affair which lasted for just over 17 minutes, it was the dead man who came out on top, though just barely, and only after delivering 3 tombstone piledrivers. Needless to say then, nothing was fully resolved, and so, the following month at Unforgiven in Your House, the feud would continue, with things this time moving over to the confines of an Inferno match. Yes, it was fire that had started the beef between the two, so it only made sense that it would be fire that would end it. That said, despite Kane's best efforts here, he'd fail to win again, as after 16 minutes, his arm would be set alight, and not only would he be declared the loser, but he'd have to relive the trauma of his past all over again. Why was that? Well, while Kane had survived the fire which killed his parents, it had left him badly burned in the process. Of course, as the years went on, new revelations would come to light regarding this aspect of the story, but for the time being, no one was talking about that. No, what they were instead talking about was the fact that after The Undertaker inadvertently helped his brother to defeat Stone Cold Steve Austin for the WWF title at June 28th's King of the Ring, it looked like the two might finally be on the same page. But as speculation ran rampant over the next couple of months, The Undertaker would continually deny that he had any such new allegiances. That was until the lead-up to September 27th's breakdown in Your House, of course, because at this point, it would be revealed that the pair had indeed reconciled and that they would both be going forward as a heel unit from there. What made them heels? Well, they were acting as the newest hand-picked surrogates for Vince McMahon to get the WWF title back off Steve Austin. So hoping to ensure at least one of them won the belt then, the boss would place the siblings into a triple threat match with the Rattlesnake at the subsequent pay-per-view, with the rule being that Taker could not pin Kane, and likewise, Kane could not pin Taker. Sure, this effectively made it a handicap bout and pretty much ensured Austin would lose, but one thing Vince hadn't planned for was the possibility that both brothers would cover the champion simultaneously and each hold a claim to the belt. So with both now arguing that they were the true champ, another singles bout between the two was booked for October 18th's Judgment Day in Your House, with Steve Austin here being appointed the special guest referee. Of course, as a result of the Rattlesnake's shenanigans though, this would end up going to a no contest, and so, instead, a one-night tournament would be held at November's Survivor Series to determine once and for all who the new champion was. But while neither Kane or The Undertaker would win this one, it wouldn't be the big story for them by that point anyway, because come the end of the year, the real focus would be on the fact that the Dead Man and Paul Bearer had privately been conspiring to turn on Kane as they felt they didn't need him anymore. And that wasn't all either. No, in the process of doing just this, the newly heel Phenom would also reveal that he had been the one who started the fire which killed his parents after all, and that he'd done so purposefully. So with this meaning the Big Red Machine no longer had his brother or Paul Bearer, someone who had by this point been revealed to be his birth father, he'd become an unlikely babyface hero as he instead moved on to a program with X-Pac. Not that the two siblings wouldn't have interactions after this though. No, at December 13th's Rock Bottom in Your House, in fact, Kane would get some measure of revenge over his older sibling when he caused him to lose a buried alive match against Steve Austin. That said, for the majority of the year which followed, the two would largely remain separate, with them not really coming back together again until the summer of 2000. What happened then? Well, after The Undertaker had morphed into his American Badass persona and the duo had gotten into another fight at August's SummerSlam, they would come together again to reform the Brothers of Destruction, albeit this time as a babyface act. And that meant no heel on the roster was safe anymore, least of all Triple H and Steve Austin, each of whom would find themselves in the crosshair of the big men following WrestleMania 17. But that wasn't all the Brothers of Destruction had to contend with throughout 2001 as it happened, because this year would also mark the invasion of both WCW and ECW. So feeling like they needed to defend their home base then, both Kane and The Undertaker would become a lot more open to working with their WWF peers on a more regular basis. Not that they weren't able to take care of their own business themselves too, however, because while the American Badass was dealing with the advances of Diamond Dallas Page on his wife, the Big Red Machine was winning multiple singles titles, including both the Hardcore and Intercontinental straps. And when they weren't doing that, they were winning tag team gold together as well, with them at one point becoming the first duo to ever unify the WWF and WCW tag team titles. That said, by the time the invasion ended that November, the siblings would have gone their own separate ways again, with The Undertaker turning heel once more and morphing into Big Evil. There was little the two had to talk about. But even if they did, they would largely be separated by the brand split anyway, as with Kane becoming a Raw mainstay and his brother eventually finding a permanent home on SmackDown, there was no real opportunity for them to interact. Perhaps that was for the best though, because they each had their own problems to worry about by then. And while for Big Evil this meant feuding with Brock Lesnar over the WWE title, for his younger brother it meant finally removing his mask and being forced to confront the fact that the scars on his face had never been real. No, instead it had only been emotional scars he'd suffered during the fire. And so with this realization causing him to snap, Kane would become the Red Brand's biggest villain once more, as he laid waste to everyone in his path over the subsequent weeks and months. Of course, he couldn't stay away from his brother forever though, and that was why, at the November 16, 2003 Survivor Series, the Big Red Machine would attempt to remind The Undertaker who the real alpha male of the family was when he cost him a buried alive match against Vince McMahon and caused him to be buried 6 feet under as a result. So as a consequence of this then, Big Evil would disappear from TV, with the speculation being that, before long, Mark Calloway would be returning, and he would be doing so under the old Deadman incarnation of the gimmick. And after months of fans wondering about this, all the speculation would finally be put to bed when, on March 14, 2004 at WrestleMania 20, the Phenom would finally return to WWE to defeat his brother on the grandest stage of them all for a second time. But with this formally reigniting the beef between the two, they weren't going to leave it there. No, instead they'd continue to interact with each other semi-regularly over the next few years, most notably in 2005. When during a brand warfare segment leading up to that year's Survivor Series, the two briefly came to blows. That said, like all family, forgiveness would always come in the end, and so, by the autumn of 2006, the duo would be back on the same page once more and would be ready to team up with each other all over again. Of course, this was bad news for their two rivals at the time, Mr. Kennedy and MVP, as now, instead of only having to contend with one, they'd have to take on both Brothers of Destruction in a tag team match on the October 27th episode of SmackDown that year. And with this going well for the babyfaces, they would continue to occasionally pair up over the years which followed, usually doing so when one had to deal with a particularly troublesome opponent and so needed some backup in order to help them out. It happened when the Deadman went up against La Familia in the lead up to WrestleMania 24, and it happened again when the Big Red Machine needed some assistance in fending off Jericho a year later. And so, with it seeming like all the wounds of the past between them had finally healed then, it looked very much like the decade-plus long feud between The Undertaker and Kane had finally come to a close, with the two now seeing eye to eye finally. At least that's what Kane wanted people to believe. That said, in truth, he still harbored some ill will toward his brother. After all, he'd been the one to start that fire so many years ago. And with the Phenom now very much being the babyface in fans' minds again, this only left the Big Red Machine that much more frustrated, as he felt like all the terrible things which had been done to him were now largely being forgotten by fans. So perhaps that was why in the summer of 2010, he'd hatch a plan to get even with The Undertaker once and for all. A plan which began with an, at the time, mystery assailant laying waste to the dead man on the June 4th episode of SmackDown and leaving him in a vegetative state. Of course, despite Kane's claims that he had nothing to do with the attack, it was clear to anyone who was paying attention that he was the man behind the whole thing. Either way, though, as a result of his brother having been removed from the equation, the Big Red Machine was finally able to free himself from his shadow for the first time, and as a consequence of this, win the Money in the Bank contract at the titular pay-per-view 1 month later. And soon after that, he'd even cash in this contract to snag the World Heavyweight title from Rey Mysterio. That said, his celebrations would be short-lived because, after successfully defending this belt at August's SummerSlam, the Phenom would return to confront his would-be attacker, only to then get laid out once more with a tombstone piledriver. Yes, in a moment of symmetry, the same move which had sparked their initial feud back in 1997 would now send the two brothers spiraling off into a program one more time. This time, though, it would not be a clean sweep for the older sibling because, now having the title around his waist and years of additional experience under his belt, the Big Red Machine was more than ready to come out on top. And he would prove this when the two went one-on-one at the following month's Night of Champions, with him there showing that he had become the stronger brother during the intervening years when he scored a clean victory and retained the World Heavyweight title. So feeling like he needed to do something extra so as to be able to get the better of Kane once more, then, The Undertaker would reach back into his past by recruiting Paul Bearer to stand by his side as he prepared for the rematch at October's Hell in a Cell pay-per-view. There, though, inside of the same titular cage where it all began, the dead man's mentor would give him one last lesson in watching his back when he turned on him, then allowed his kayfabe son to hit a massive chokeslam and score the victory once more. Yes, now having come out on the losing end on 2 straight occasions, Mark Calloway was left to wonder if maybe he hadn't finally reached the end of his road, and that perhaps he should just hang up his boots and admit his era was over. But while many would have gone ahead and done just this, giving up was not something the former WWE champion had in his arsenal, and so instead, he would issue one more challenge to his younger brother for the following month's bragging rights, with this one being a buried alive match where things could be settled once and for all in the most final of ways. Of course, many expected The Undertaker to win this one then, as this was what storyline logic would usually dictate. But instead of that happening, in a swerve, Kane would actually score a 3rd straight victory here after the Nexus interfered and helped him to bury his older sibling 6 feet under, with this finally ending the lengthy saga of the Brothers of Destruction. Well, sort of. Because, while this was the last time the two would feud, they would still occasionally appear on screen together. Though now, with them finally having put their issues to bed, whenever they did so in the future, it would always be part of a team. Yes, whenever a job got too much for one of them, the other could always be called upon to offer some backup, just as they had in the old days. And this would allow the brothers to score a few more nostalgic wins over the course of the 2010s against teams such as The Shield, the Wyatt family, and even D-Generation X. That said, since their last team-up against Shawn Michaels and Triple H at the Best Left Forgotten Crown Jewel show in November of 2018, The Undertaker has decided to finally retire for good, ending a 3-decade-long run which can stand amongst the greatest of all time. And with Kane seemingly having moved away from the ring for the most part too, it looks like it is really over for the duo in terms of their storied rivalry. But even if it is over, what a rivalry it was. After all, it's hard to think of another one which has managed to span so many different eras and see so many faces come and go around it. Really, in a way, you could argue that this program was the backbone of the company for many years, because no matter what else was going on, fans could always count on the Brothers of Destruction being there, and that whenever they were, whether they were kicking ass together or feuding with one another, true to their name, somebody was gonna get destroyed before the night was out.